Okay, this is take 2 for NC State Dendrology. We're going to finish up our discussion on conifers today, focusing on reproduction and looking at different types of cones that we see in different types of conifers. So first, let's do a little bit of tree trivia. So which pines have the biggest cones on Earth? So big is always a relative term, right? If you look at coulter pine, that has the largest cones. Pinus coulteri, I have some of those in lab. And then sugar pine has the longest cones. That's Pinus lambertiana. We might learn more about those later on in the semester. So quick lecture outline. So this is our second lecture on gymnosperms. We've talked about foliage differences. Today we'll focus on the reproductive cones. And we'll start by talking about types of cones and then the different parts or cone morphology. And then we'll talk about some special adaptations that some cones have. So in this class, Forestry 339-501, we will look mainly at two different families, but also ginkgo. We have to add in there, right? We count that among the gymnosperms, right? Where, ginkgos don't have cones at all. They just have these naked seeds that look like a fruit, but we'll never call it a fruit because fruit is limited to the angiosperms. So in Pinaceae, we'll see flat-scaled cones, and then Cupressaceae have peltate-scaled cones. So that's an easy way to tell which family of gymnosperms you have when you're looking at an unknown species. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. So when we talk about Pinaceae with these flat-scaled cones, you're probably very familiar with pine cones and wondered why we're learning about cone scales being flat. But basically, it's an important differentiation between that and peltate-scaled cones, like you can see in this Sequoia sempervirens on the right. So peltate means shield-shaped, and unlike the pine cones, you can see that the sequoia has this kind of a strange, right? It makes more of a rounded fruit. And so the cone scales are peltate or shield shaped. So they start narrow towards the middle and then they flare out as they get to the outside. So to me, they don't look super like shields, but peltate is the term that we use to describe those. So remember, conifers don't flower, right? Flowers are reserved for flowering plants, which are angiosperms. Conifers and gymnosperms are more primitive, and they have cones, right? So we have male and female cones. These are separate structures in these gymnosperms. And let's break those down a little bit more. So the male cones have the name Microsporangiate strobilus, or strobili, which is the plural. Micro meaning small, spore meaning spore, angiate means vessel, and strobilus means cone. And then we have the female cones are Megasporangiate strobilus, and that's the mega meaning large, spore meaning spore, angiate meaning vessel, strobilus meaning cone. And in gymnosperms, most of the species that we encounter are monoecious, right? And if you recall that, that means the female cones are, and the male cones are on separate structures, but on individual plants. But we have a couple of examples of dioecious cones where we have separate male and female individuals. And we'll talk about those more in a minute. Generally speaking, female cones are more numerous at the tops of the trees, and male cones are more numerous lower down. So why might that be? Well, the male pollen is very, very small and lightweight. It has no trouble traveling via the wind. And the female cones are at the top, and so it's got a little bit heavier seeds, and they need to be at the top of the tree. First of all, they're kind of removed from each other just to avoid self-pollination or selfing. So that's one reason, and then also just the size of those cones means that the heavier ones need to be closer to the top so they can spread more easily. So let's break down the strobilus, or the cone, for the female. This is the Megasporangiate. And when we're talking about multiple cones, we might call them strobili. That's the plural of strobilus. And in male cones, the central axis where the scales are attached to stem tissue, whereas the scales themselves are leaf tissue. In the females, the entire structure is stem tissue. We can think of the female cones that are actually short shoots. And so you can see in this little diagram, gymnosperm seeds, right? These are the closed cones. And so this is the cone and what it looks like before fertilization. And so you have the cone scale, and those immature seeds, those ovules, lie right up on top of the cone scale. And then after pollination, right, the cone scale is still intact here, and the seeds are still in the same place, but they are now ripening and maturing. And then those cone scales reflex back to release those seeds for dispersal. So let's look a little bit more closely at Microsporangia. These are the male cones. And these are much, much smaller than female cones. So pollen is really tiny and doesn't take a lot of energy to produce. So I like to say that pollen is cheap. And the Microsporangia are borne in pairs at the base of papery scales. So they have lots of these microspore mother cells that form the pollen. And this electron microscope photo in the center is just a cross section of just one of these little Microsporangia. And then you can see this is what Pinus taeta looks like in the early spring when it releases its pollen all at once. So it flies out. So let's look at this a little bit more closely. If we zoom in a little bit, you can see this is the central axis or stem, right, which we know is made of stem tissue. And then you can see inside of this cone scale, right, which is leaf tissue, this pollen sac. So this is the structure that contains all of the tiny pollen cells. And this photo here on the right is a photo of Pinus strobilus pollen. And you can see it's actually kind of looks like Mickey Mouse ears. And it's actually pretty large. So people love blaming pines on their allergies in the early spring, but pine pollen is actually too large to be a particulate that can get inside the human respiratory system. So we blame pines, but it's really the oaks that have the pollen that people are allergic to. If we look at the female cones or the Megasporangia, we have the female strobilus here on the left, and this is what it looks like before pollination and fertilization, where you have the seed scales, right? And then there's bract scales that are below it. So little leafy tissue just below underneath those seed scales. And then you have the ovule, right? Which is the unfertilized haploid seed. And then after pollination and fertilization, you have this more developed, ripened cone. So some of the parts are still the same, right? So you still have the woody seed scale, and the ovules are now completely developing into these ripened seeds. And the bract scales are still there, but they're much sort of disintegrate over time because they've already done their job. And we'll talk about that more in just a second. So what happens when, and how does pollination work for conifers? So all of conifers are pollinated by the wind. And so you have this big release of pollen from the male cones that grow in these lower branches. And like I said, the pollen is really small and lightweight, so it can travel great distances. And the female cones are up at the tops of the trees, so they can receive pollen that's blown in on the wind. So once the pollen gets to the female cones, right, those cone scales that the immature cones have can pull the pollen down into the ovule. And that's the case in Pinus. Sometimes that is done with water, and so there can be a pollination droplet in the ovule, and that may pull right through the process of surface tension or float pollen in to the ovule. So that can be found in Pinus, and then all of the Cupressaceae has that type of pollination. And then you even have a special case with Tsuga, where the pollen can germinate and grow into the ovule. So in this case, right, so this is in Tsuga or hemlock, right, we have the pollen grain in the end, and then it grows a pollen tube down to the ovule. This is very similar to what we have, this process that we have in angiosperms. And so let's look at the morphology of the Megasporangia. So this is just the different parts of the female cones. And so we have this central stem, and again, we can call this the rachis for simplicity. And then each of these woody structures is the cone scale, which is flat in Pinus. You can see the bract scales underneath those, and in some species, they're really well developed and very prominent. This picture of Pseudotsuga menziesii, those bracts actually extend out beyond the cone scales. And one of the traits that helps you recognize Tsuga Douglas fir is that those bracts actually, people think they look like a little mouse that's diving into the scale. So all you can see are its hind feet and its tail. And then the very end part of the cone scale is what we would call the apophysis. And that is tipped with an umbo, which is a little protrusion. And sometimes those are pointy. When the umbo is pointy, it's called a prickle. And then finally, at the very base of the cone, we have the peduncle, right? Which is the same term we use in angiosperms to describe the stem that attaches that cone or that fruit to the stem. And so, okay, we'll just to go through these definitions again, right? The apophysis is the end of those cones, right? So you can see that best in this diagram B. Often it's lighter in color and it's exposed when the cone is closed, the only thing you see is the apophysis. And then the umbo is the protrusion at the center of the apophysis, which could be shaped like a point. We call cones that have those prickles, right, or a pointy umbo, are said to be armed. And if you grab a loblolly pine cone, you could definitely tell that it's armed and it has prickles. And then those winged seeds sit on top of those cone scales. So that kind of breaks down all the different parts of a cone in Pinus. In Cupressaceae, remember we talked about peltate cone scales, right? So they can be tightly closed, just like pine cones. And some examples of genera that we'll learn in class are Taxodium, as well as Metasequoia. And then for peltate scales, they have 2 to 9 seeds per scale. So the bract is fused to the cone scale, and then the scales are fused to a central point or axis. So they're sort of sitting here gathered inside of those peltate or shield-shaped scales. And then those cones open up to get the pollen in. So that's what those look like zoomed in. And this is an example of Sequoia sempervirens. We also have examples of peltate cones that we call fleshy. And the best example of this is Juniperus, which has separate male and female on the same individual, or I'm sorry, it has separate male and female cones and separate male and female individuals. So you have individual trees that have male cones, and then you have individual trees that have female cones. So on the left, we have a male with these little tiny cones that contain the pollen. You can also see the scale-like leaves that Juniperus has. And on the right, you can see the scale-shaped leaves again and the fleshy berries that Juniperus virginiana has. We can also look at cone attachment. That can also help us tell the species. And in Western North Carolina, we'll talk about these species more, but we have Picea rubens and Abies fraseri. These make up the spruce fir forest at the highest elevations. And at first glance, these species look pretty similar. They both have these needle-like leaves. But on Picea rubens, right, the red spruce, the cones hang down underneath the branches, which you can see in the photograph that was taken up at Carver's Gap. And in Abies fraseri, the cones are perched on top of those branches. They look like little candles, and you can see the bracts that are protruding from those. So Abies, Taxodium, and Cedrus all have deciduous cones. So that means the cones disintegrate while they're attached to the tree. Whereas other species like pines have intact cones, right? So the whole pine cone will drop off, and they can either open on the tree or they'll fall on the ground. The Abies, you'll never find entire cones in the ground because they fall apart scale by scale while they're still on the tree. So if we're looking at cone development, I think it's important to see how these cones develop over time. So this is loblolly pine, our very common Piedmont pine. And you can see what the cones look like in their size at 1 year old, 2 years old, where the cones are clearly still closed, and then 3 years old, where the cones open up to release the seeds. So 3 years for maturation in loblolly pine. And these cones open and close in response to relative humidity. So how does that work? The scales are actually made of 2 layers, the top layer and the bottom layer. And you can see on the right, this Jeffrey pine cone on the left side is sealed shut and then open on the right. So when cones dry out, those 2 different layers dry at different rates. So the top layer can shrink, but not very much in a dry environment, whereas the bottom layer shrinks really drastically. And so the bottom layer of these cone scales shrinks, and then pulls those cone scales open. Most of our conifers are wind dispersed. Those cones will open in dry weather, right? You don't want it to open in wet weather because the seeds will rot because they're very tiny. So in dry weather, they open up and the seeds are released. There's a few exceptions to that. Taxodium is dispersed by water and those seeds will float. And juniperous seeds are animal dispersed. So they're eaten by animals. We also have an example of pinyon pine or Pinus edulis. This is a really important species in the West. And you can see that those pine seeds are extremely large. You might know them as pine nuts. We have some special terms that we use for certain types of cones that have certain traits. Serotinous, right? You've learned Prunus serotina, right? Meaning late. So you know that serotina means late. In this case, serotinous cones open late. So often this is a trait that is a fire adaptation. So found in species that regenerate after a catastrophic fire. In this case, the cones are actually sealed shut with resin. So instead of just drying out, that's not enough to open up those cones. You actually need the heat from the fire to melt the resin, which will then pull those cones open. And on the right, we have a photograph of Pinus pungens, one of my very favorite pines. This is Table Mountain pine, a southern Appalachian endemic. And you can see that this pine will retain years of cones along its branches until the heat from a fire melts that resin and allows those seeds to release. And it's really pretty cool if you think about it, because those cones are then opening in the perfect conditions for regeneration, right? So a catastrophic fire will wipe out all the competing vegetation, and what it leaves is this open mineral soil bed with plenty of ample sunlight. So it's really exciting to think about because these cones are adapted so that they release their seeds at the perfect time to regenerate. And so just a quick summary of conifer reproduction, right? We have the male and female cones, Megasporangia and Microsporangia. And so they come together through the process of fertilization, and then the seeds develop and develop into seedlings. You can see the blue part is of the cell is the haploid part where you have the unfertilized seeds and the pollen before it fertilizes the ovules. And then the developing seeds are in the diploid or 2N part of that seedling development. And so just a quick wrap up, right? We have conifers that generally have two different types of cones. Species in Pinaceae have flat scales, and those in Cupressaceae have peltate or shield-shaped scales. All of the conifers have male and female cones. Usually they're monoecious, where they are contained on the same individual, but there's a few dioecious species like juniperous where there's separate male and female individuals. We call the male cones Microsporangia strobili and female cones Megasporangia strobili. Remember that gymnosperms are naked seeds and they are born on top of the cone scales. And those cones reflex open at times of low humidity or sometimes after a fire to release their seeds. The seeds themselves have little wings on them, so they're wind dispersed as well as wind pollinated. There's a few exceptions to that, but most of the gymnosperms are wind dispersed. And then we have a special case of serotinous cones that only open in the intense heat of a catastrophic fire. And that is a wrap for today on gymnosperms.